Welcome to Talk Education's Guide to Saving for Your Child's Future. I'm Alice Rose and I'm delighted to be joined by Swati Taylor, Wealth Planner from LGT Vestra. Swati, we're going to talk people through the various options they have when they're thinking about saving for their child's future and all the things they need to bear in mind. So start by giving us the big picture overview about the different options, how they compare in terms of flexibility of access to the money and also the tax implications that people need to think about.
Of course. Well, there are a number of structures or tax wrappers that can be used as a savings vehicle, and it's important to say that not every single vehicle will be appropriate in every circumstance or to every individual situation, and it can be dependent on the savings objective as well as the time horizon. I think cash is our first one that you'd consider as your primary savings vehicle. For short-term savings, they definitely play a part. In terms of accessibility, it will be very dependent upon what type of bank account you have. Those with higher interest rates tend to have some lock-in periods or require a regular contribution to be made to them. Over and above cash savings, there are some primary types of savings vehicles that we would consider, such as an ISA, a junior ISA, or an unwrapped investment account. Some of these are quite complex, and seeking professional advice before embarking on saving large amounts would be advisable.
So let's start with the ISA. We've all heard of that.
Yeah, so that's one of the main wrappers that are available to a family. Each UK resident adult will have a ISA allowance from the age of 16 onwards, and it's £20,000 a year at the moment. When you're 16 to 18, it can only be invested in a cash ISA, but from 18 onwards you can have it in stocks and shares as well. It is possible to have both running at the same time. They grow completely free of tax, and all withdrawals in the future are also free of tax, so they're very tax efficient vehicles for you to have.
So everybody should be using their ISA allowances?
Absolutely, yeah. It was probably the first place that we would go for saving for the longer term.
Okay.
Access is normally relatively easy. It does depend on what you've got underlying in the investment vehicle. So if you are investing in stocks and shares, it could take a couple of weeks for the investments to settle. Similarly, if you're investing in a cash ISA, if it's an easy access one, obviously you'd expect it to be pretty quick. But if you're in a fixed term ISA, then you may have some penalties and things to consider if you're trying to break out that earlier.
So pick your ISA carefully.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then junior ISAs, how are they different?
So junior ISAs are for our children. They can start from any age from birth up to the age of 18. And the annual allowance at the moment for junior ISAs is £9,000 a year.
Okay.
They grow, and the same tax efficiencies apply as a normal ISA, so they're tax-free on the growth and tax-free on withdrawals, but you can't access them until you're 18 because they are for the benefit of the child.
If I'm thinking about saving for school fees, and your colleague Simon did a brilliant video for us, which can be found on our website, about saving for school fees, are ISAs appropriate for saving for school fees?
Yeah, ISAs definitely are appropriate for school fees. They allow your investments to grow tax-free, and it's, like I said, it's tax-free on your withdrawal. A junior ISA, however, probably not appropriate because you can't access them until the child's 18. So if you need the monies beforehand. So
I, the adult, can't access them. My child, nobody can access them.
Nobody can access them. So they are locked up till the child's age 18.
Okay.
What you may want to consider for junior ISAs is potentially helping with university fees or the first property purchase. Then they're quite an ideal type of savings vehicle.
A longer term savings, right.
There is one other thing there for children, that when they are between 16 and 18, you actually have the benefit of both a junior ISA allowance and an ISA allowance. Okay. So you have the £9,000 and the £20,000.
Both in the same child's name?
Yeah.
Okay. Beyond ISAs, where do we get to?
Sure, so if you're using your ISA allowances already, then for additional savings alongside an ISA, an unwrapped or a general investment account is a suitable vehicle to have alongside that. There's no contribution limits like you have with ISAs, and the withdrawals are free of tax when they're taken out, but there is tax incurred within the wrapper itself. So any investment income that's generated by the underlying funds is taxable. So if it's interest income, then it's taxed at your income tax rate. And if it's dividend income, then it's taxed at 7.5% for a basic rate taxpayer, 32.5% for a high rate taxpayer, and 38.1% for an additional rate taxpayer. So slightly lower than income tax rates. Each individual does, however, have a dividend allowance that you can use to offset this, as well as a personal savings allowance. Alongside the investment income, any capital gain that you actually realise, whether that be from rebalancing the portfolio or from withdrawing funds, can also be liable to capital gains tax, and that's at 10% for a basic rate or 20% for a high rate. But we each have an annual capital gains exemption of $12,300 a year. So by making use of all these allowances that we probably aren't using otherwise, we can make that account very tax efficient for individuals.
So that's why it's worth people talking to a wealth planner like you, because you can make sense of all that for somebody's individual circumstances.
Absolutely.
Beyond these investment accounts, where do we get to if we want other options?
So beyond these investment accounts, there are offshore bonds that can be considered, which you normally go into that when you've gone over and above using the ISAs and sort of maxed out the efficiency of using a general investment account. And also pensions you'll tend to have anyway along the way from employers and things like that. Both of these are much more complex in terms of their tax efficiencies and allowances, and we definitely recommend seeking professional advice before embarking on those.
Brilliant.
Yep.
So Swati, can children hold investment accounts in their own names?
So we can hold investment accounts in children's names, but they have to be held via what we call a bare trust,
Okay.
just because they are minors.
Right.
But it does make use of their own allowances, as well as the parents being able to have investment accounts in their names. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that if a parent's gifting the money into the children's names, there is this thing called the parental settlement rules.
Okay.
Now, if an investment is generating more than £100 a year,
Which you'd hope it would be.
Yeah. Then the income generated is actually taxed on the parent who's made the gift, rather than being using the children's allowances. But capital gains allowances would still be used by the child. So I think, in theory, that type of an investment account works best when the monies are gifted by someone else, like grandparents or other family members.
So Swati, we talked about flexibility. Presumably parents need to bear in mind what they're saving this money for, whether it's for school fees, sort of medium term, or whether they're looking at longer term investment horizons, like saving for a house perhaps, or university fees. And also they need to take the age of their child into consideration, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's likely that we all have a number of different savings objectives at any one time. For instance, you could be saving for school fees, but at the same time you're thinking about university fees down the line, or maybe helping with a property purchase, or even our own retirement. So we have our own savings goals as well. So each savings objective has a different investment horizon and a different level of risk that you'd want to take with that because of the investment horizon. So, for instance, for school fees, if you're starting a bit later and you might need them in the next couple of years, risking that investment, is a bit of a concern. So actually having it as a cash savings and an easily accessible type of investment vehicle is more appropriate. But if you're saving for university fees and you're starting, when the child's born and you're using a junior ISA allowances, then that's a more appropriate type of vehicle for you. Though one thing I would touch on is if you are using junior ISA allowances, then just being mindful that if you use them each year from birth to age 18, you're going to have a pot that could build up to about £245,000 for the child's 18 if it's growing at 5% a year, for instance. So, you've got to take into account the children's age as well when you think about putting this money aside.
Absolutely. So that brings me neatly to my next question, which is, I can't be the only parent who thinks it might be a really bad thing for my children to have this potentially really large sum of money when they're 18. What can I do to control their access to it?
So I think, if you are using a junior ISA allowance, it is quite hard to control access because they do become ultimately entitled to the allowance. I think you have to just bear in mind that while we have tax allowances available, you've got to weigh that up against the responsibility you're putting on the child by giving them such a large amount. There are steps you might want to take. You might want to wait till the child's a bit older before you start to use the allowances so you get a better understanding of their personality. Or the other option is to just invest in your own name and then gift at the appropriate time that the child needs the funds. The other option is also having an investment manager who looks after the investments for you, because that creates almost a barrier for the child when they get to age 18. And
so rather than just being able to spend it, they have to come to you to ask for access to it.
Absolutely.
I think that's a much better idea.
Yeah.
So Swati, if grandparents or other relatives are kind enough to want to give my child money, what's the best way for them to do this?
Well, we all have various allowances that we can use for inheritance tax savings. So we have an annual allowance individually of £3,000 a year. And if you haven't used it in the previous year, you can carry it forward for a year. So every 2 years, as a couple, you could have £12,000 you could gift without any inheritance tax implications. Alongside that, you can also gift out of surplus income, as long as you can maintain your normal expenditure. And again, there's no implications there for inheritance tax. And finally, you can gift much larger amounts of money if you happen to be fortunate enough to be able to do so. But at that point, you just have to bear in mind that you need to survive the gift by 7 years before it stops having any inheritance tax implications. So if you wanted to use the annual gifts or the gifts out of income, then that's quite a nice way of being able to gift directly for school fees, for instance, or building a regular investment into a pot for the child. Similarly, larger gifts could be invested sort of earlier on for the child, and that could benefit from compound interest. And that could then be used to draw down on to fund school fees, or just a nice pot for the child to have when they get to 18 to use towards a house purchase. So, for instance, using the investment account via a bear trust like we spoke before. I mean, I think grandparents can use any of those vehicles that we talked about. They could use the junior ISA allowances, but it's always best to sort of talk to the parents first, because a junior ISA allowance is one of those ones that parents can use without having the parental settlement rules apply.
So we've given people a lot of information. Let's just try and sum it all up.
Absolutely. Well, I think in terms of allowances, the main ones that we should be considering are your ISAs, definitely, and then you've got the capital gains exemptions and your dividend allowances that you can use via the investment accounts. And then obviously for much longer term savings, you've got things like your pensions for your own retirement. Utilising the various allowances as appropriate and building up a sort of portfolio of different types of vehicles will allow the most flexibility when it comes for withdrawal and funding your different investment objectives. When investing on behalf of children, parents just need to be aware of the parental settlement rules and just making sure that they are investing in the right vehicles that's appropriate. I think having regular conversations about money, especially in a practical way, will help children become ready for any sort of investments that you've put aside for them, which they might become entitled to at age 18, and the importance and responsibility that comes with that sort of savings and the funds that they're about to receive. And there are a number of options to parents and family members to use their own allowances to build up these savings portfolios.
Brilliant. And if people need guidance, you would be delighted to help them, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yes. And I think it's very important to get professional guidance on this sorts of things, especially when we're talking about larger amounts of money and you're building up a savings portfolio.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.